Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of SAFT Podcast. And I am so delighted to be back on the guest interview bit of the podcast series. As you know, we've been going through the National Theology series, and we summed up the moral argument after a very long set of videos and podcasts interacting with the moral argument. And we're going to take a break from the National Theology series for a while and interact with some exciting topics and exciting hot button issues that are happening around the world, especially that is as it relates to Christianity and apologetics. And so I have a very exciting guest, and I won't drag the time much further, but I'm very much delighted to have Tim Barnett of the famous Red Pen Logic join us for the first time on SAFT Podcast. Tim, welcome to SAFT Podcast.
Hey, it's great to be on the show. This is going to be a fun interview.
Excellent. And as our audience, you will be very much familiar with Tim's work with the Red Pen Logic. We will be dropping a link in the description for you to check it out. It's an excellent resource and also an excellent place for us to see how we can succinctly and remarkably take down arguments and win souls for Christ. Now, I am having Tim here not to talk much about Red Pen Logic, but I would have loved to get into how Tim got the idea and how it all came together. Maybe we'll take Tim a quick 60 seconds to let us know how did Red Pen Logic come about.
Sure. So I used to be a full-time high school science and math teacher. And so one of the things we do as a teacher is you correct students' work. You pull out the red pen, and you do that not because you're trying to hurt the students, but because you care and you're trying to help them learn. And a few years ago, I think it was 2019, before the pandemic, I had this idea, a tweet, and it has 100,000, but it has a glaring logical fallacy. And if you see the logical fallacy, all of a sudden this rhetorical tweet loses all of its rhetorical force. So I took my red pen out and actually kind of drew on the tweet and then posted it online. And to my surprise, this thing was getting shared all over the place. And I thought, man, maybe there's something to this. And the person who tweeted it was actually an actress. She was on Whose Line Is It Anyway? So she's kind of famous. And we actually interacted with each other on Twitter. It was very interesting. And I thought, man, there's something here. There's a need for this kind of thing. So we started doing this more regularly. And then it became a whole video thing where we were responding not just to tweets and memes, but there's a lot of video content out there where people are making claims, giving arguments, and they need a quick response. And so that's what we did. We grabbed videos from TikTok or Instagram Reels or YouTube Shorts and give a quick response. So that usually those videos are 1 minute long, and I take about 2 minutes to respond. We try to keep the videos around 3 minutes in length, which helps a lot of people because they don't have a lot of time.
Yeah.
And it's become, to my surprise, just wildly popular on YouTube and some of these other platforms. So yeah, having a lot of fun doing that. And I think that the key is to help people. I was a teacher and still am a teacher in many ways. And I want to help people learn critical thinking, not just what to think, but how to think.
Yeah.
And so here's one view, here's the counter response, and let the listener decide.
Excellent. Right. So what the reason that I've had you on the podcast right now is to talk about your very exciting brand new book on deconstruction, the deconstruction of Christianity, what it is, why it's destructive, and how to respond. Now, I've had your co-author Alyssa Childers on the podcast a long while back, and it's pretty exciting to have you on to discuss about this brand new work that you have come together. So there is a lot to unpack here. As your book also points out, it's not what it seems at the start. So maybe we can go over with discussing what is deconstruction. I mean, we'll unpack it a whole lot more, the nuances and the philosophical underpinnings, but in a gist, right? What is deconstruction?
Yeah. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head there. I mean, this is the $1 million question. This is the question that we need to nail down if we're going to be able to move forward. This actually was brought to our attention a number of years ago when John Cooper, he's a
Yeah.
famous front man for this band Skillet, he went on stage in front of like 15,000 people at this concert called this event called Winter Jam.
Hmm.
And he declared war against deconstruction. Okay. And then all of a sudden, all the Christian media outlets were going wild. Okay. And blogs were being written. And what we noticed was in that term they were using it to mean everything from questions, just you're deconstructing questions, all the way to spectrum to
Hmm.
leaving the faith altogether. Not just questioning the faith, but leaving the faith. So something like deconversion.
Hmm.
And because of definitions, this caused people to talk past each other and not understand where each other was coming from. That became clear. So Elisa Childers and I, we decided, man, we want to help bring clarity to this topic. And so we underwent this kind of research project. What is this word really mean? And so here's our
Hmm.
definition, and we can unpack it as we go.
Yeah.
But here's where we landed. And by the way, this was the most difficult sentence to write in the entire book. Okay. Like 65,000 words. This was the most difficult sentence because we knew however
Hmm.
we define this thing, going to have to be able to defend it. And
Yeah.
by the way, our definition that I'm going to give you in a moment here that we landed on, this wasn't where we thought we were going to, this wasn't how we thought we were going to define deconstruction at the
Hmm. Hmm.
beginning. Okay. We actually changed our minds about this as we dove deeper and deeper into what might be called the deconstruction movement. So here's the definition. Deconstruction is a process of rethinking your faith without requiring as a standard. It is
Hmm.
and not just a process, it's a postmodern process
Right.
of rethinking your faith without requiring scripture as a standard. And all those words are really important in our definition.
Right. And that's, I think that very, and like you said, it's quite difficult to bring that together as a definition, especially because when the whole dialogue about deconstruction was picking up pace, there were these
Mm.
inputs, well-meaning, well-intended inputs to demarcate between a helpful, a healthy deconstruction versus,
Yeah.
an unhealthy deconstruction. And when I was engaging with the
Yeah.
topic of deconstruction as well, the immediate impression that was coming to me was, well, deconstruction is about questioning your faith and revisiting the beliefs that you hold on to so sternly to see if it warrants belief. But once you dive deeper into the whole deconstruction rabbit hole, you realize that there is no healthy form of deconstruction, and that definition saying that deconstruction, when you do
Yeah.
it without the authority of scripture, is what deconstruction is all about. Well, there is no longer a healthy form of deconstruction. Now, in your book, you point out the history of deconstruction, right? Even though this may be a term that is coming to prominence of late, we have Jacques Derrida, a philosopher who is known as the father of deconstruction, and he had his own conceptualization, a very postmodern, as you said, a postmodern conceptualization of
Yeah.
deconstruction. Now, to our viewers, postmodernism, well, it's a big philosophical term, but to present what it
Yeah.
is basically all about is it has to do with leaning on subjective truth, subjectivism. There is no objective truth, there is no
Yeah.
objective meaning for words. So that is in a very, very succinct way what postmodernism or postmodern thought is all about. Now, Jacques Derrida was a postmodern thinker,
Yeah.
and he came up with his conceptualization of deconstruction. And we don't have the time, or it would go too off topic to dive into what Jacques Derrida was all about. But what sort of connection do
Yeah.
you see with his sort of high-end philosophical work in deconstruction and the trend of deconstruction, people moving away from faith, that you find among TikTokers and Instagrammers?
Yeah, this is great. So what we noticed, because there's a claim that's out there that this faith deconstruction has no connection to postmodern deconstruction. That's the
Hmm.
claim of some that are out there. And to be honest, when we started, we thought, okay, fair enough. That's where we'll start from. But what we noticed was as we dove deeper and deeper, there wasn't an emphasis on truth being the
Hmm.
goal, not objective truth. And so when that became more and more apparent as we kind of went down this rabbit hole, what we found was, man, maybe there is a connection to this
Hmm.
postmodern idea where objective truth and meaning For Derrida, it was about, literary texts,
Hmm.
the author's intent had no more meaning than the reader's
Right.
impact. So the reader could actually bring just as much meaning to the text as the author who wrote
Hmm.
it. And what we're noticing in this whole faith deconstruction world is that philosophy applied by Derrida to literary texts is being applied to the whole concept of religion.
Right.
And because Christianity is a religion, it's being applied to Christianity. And so it's not really about what's true or what's false. What it comes down to is more a subjective nature. What is right and good for me, or
Hmm.
what's healthy or harmful for me. And so that's where you're going to see when it comes to doctrines like hell, or doctrines like complementarianism, or
Hmm.
doctrines like inerrancy. There's different there. You could try out all these doctrines.
Yeah.
What we don't see is scripture and saying, what about this? And try to get at what Paul really meant.
Hmm.
Instead, Paul's words are just dismissed altogether. Well, why? Is it because his words are false? No, it's because they're toxic. It's
Hmm.
because the person is saying that's Paul. It doesn't really matter what Paul meant. What matters is what we mean today. And so you end up again having this kind of, we're going to determine what's right and wrong,
Right.
good or bad, healthy and harmful. We're not so much interested in what's the truth. And this is why, by the way, when you start to listen to some of the deconstruction coaches out there, so there's people that will kind of help you through your deconstruction, they'll often say that there's no right destination in where
Hmm.
you're where
Hmm.
you should land. So I'm not going to tell you where to land. And by the way, there's no right destination. And so you can think of it like this. If you were to ask someone, what is the right vacation destination?
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, it's going to depend on the
Yeah.
person and what they're into and what they like to do. For some people, it's hiking through the Grand Canyon. For other people, it's laying on the beach in Hawaii. Now, it just depends on the person and what their preferences are, and it's very subjective when it comes to
Hmm.
vacation destinations. In a very similar way, when you ask someone what's the right religious destination, well, for some people, that's going to be Christianity. For other people, it's going to be New Age or Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam or no religion whatsoever. I mean, so, and again, it doesn't matter where you land, they're all equally valid. Now, that statement only makes sense
Hmm.
if you're treating religion as a postmodern, not as a objective truth thing.
Yeah.
And so this was like the alarm, like the alarm went off as we were starting to read through, said a moment ago. Because actually, when we started writing this book, like I got the notes, we were calling healthy deconstruction a certain
Hmm.
thing and unhealthy deconstruction, and we were using those terms. So we're adding
Yeah.
adjectives to the word deconstruction and saying, okay, there's a healthy way to do this and an unhealthy way.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
healthy way, use your Bible. The unhealthy way, don't. Well, what we found was this healthy deconstruction, it was hard to find for starters. And second of all, there seemed to be something inherent in
Hmm.
deconstruction itself that made it unhealthy. And so once we kind of got rid of this presupposition we were starting with, that deconstruction is neutral, and we started looking with fresh eyes at what's going on in this movement, we found, yeah, it's not a neutral thing. There really is a game plan going on in this movement, whether people realize it or not. When you spend some time on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, whatever, you start to see that deconstruction, there's something going on that's not neutral, that is literally trying to pull people away from a certain kind of belief system. And that we call it historic Christianity.
Hmm.
People might call it, Orthodox Christianity, whatever, but they're being pulled away from those beliefs about Jesus, about God, about his word, about heaven and hell, all these different things, towards something else, whether it's progressive Christianity or somewhere else. So this is why this really isn't like just semantics. It is important that Christians understand what's going on in this movement. And there's some other reasons too, but we can get into those as we go down the road here.
Yeah. And you mentioned in one of your articles that as you engaged with this topic of deconstruction more and more, you had 3 points where you had a course correction, an error correction of sort, where you were setting your track, realizing, okay, this is what I thought deconstruction was, and it's not what it is. You have covered one, as you said, there is no correct destination, there is no end place, one specific target to reach. And you mentioned in the beginning also in your definition of deconstruction as this is something that is devoid of the authority and guidance of scripture, and we will look at some of its nuances later on. But there's another one that you mentioned there where it said there is no end to it. This deconstruction process has no set end to it. Now that, for those who are familiar with postmodern thought, would immediately realize and say, well, that is what you would expect of it. But what does this look like in real life for people who are holding on to beliefs? I mean, they are going to hold on to beliefs within religion, outside of religion. And the postmodern thought is something that permeates all sorts of beliefs and all sorts of engagement with the reality itself. So what is this second point where you rectified your understanding of deconstruction? What does that tell us about the movement?
Yeah, so this is really good. So we just said there's no correct destination, and that tipped us off, hey, maybe there's a postmodern connection. And then we saw that there's no final end to this process. There's no ending. And what I mean by that is it's not like there's a once you've deconstructed, you start to reconstruct, and that's going to be your belief system. Instead, you're encouraged by the deconstruction coaches to never reconstruct, always be deconstructing your beliefs. And in fact, I mean, this is where the self-refuting nature of the postmodern idea starts to come into play, because the deconstruction coach will tell you, well, just don't hold beliefs. Like, don't reconstruct new beliefs. The problem is that is a belief in itself that you are holding on to. So whether you like it or not, you're constructing new beliefs. In fact, as an example in the article, I cited the naked pastor. So he, and I don't want people to Google naked pastor. Okay, that's not a good idea. Okay, I don't know what kind of images are going to pop up on your computer screen. So just take my word for this. Okay, but he's got multiple videos that say, don't just deconstruct. Just deconstruct. He says, it's beautiful. Don't try to reconstruct, because you're only going to have to deconstruct what you just reconstructed. And you're on the hamster wheel. Deconstruction, and reconstruction, deconstruction, reconstruction, deconstruction. And that's what Derek Webb, who was part of Caedmon's Call, he tweeted, it's existentially exhausting. And of course it would be. I mean, that I agree with him. That makes perfect sense if that's the hamster wheel you're on. And so what his solution is, just stop believing things. Just stop believing. Of course, again, we just said that's self-refuting. So what we're encouraging is that, okay, this no ending, don't go down that rabbit trail. Don't go that direction, because again, it's self-refuting and it's existentially exhausting. What we want you to do is find out what's true. Like, search after truth. If you're going to start questioning beliefs, which by the way, Elisa and I are perfectly, like, we're fine with that. But we're like, people are going through doubts. And so seek after the truth, but the process matters. And if you take the naked pastor's process and all these other guys who are advocating deconstruction, their process never ends. What we're saying is, no, if you're after truth, which is the idea, this goes back to the ancients, they're seeking after truth. I think it's a human thing, not a modernist thing, that you want to align your life with the true, the good, and the beautiful. And that's what we're advocating for. And we think that using scripture is a great tool to do that. But back to naked pastor for a second, because he is the one who says, don't reconstruct. But what you find very interesting when you go to his accounts, like his Instagram, which has 100,000 followers, actually more than that, you find that he has reconstructed a belief system. Okay. And it's a very progressive Christian belief system where, you know, he's challenging historic Christian beliefs and offering up a new kind of belief system that puts love, you know, and of course he defines what love is, at the center. Love over verses, you know, one of his little cartoons says. Okay, that's a belief system, whether he likes to admit it or not. And so he has reconstructed. So again, they talk inside their mouth saying, don't reconstruct. But at the other side of their mouth, they're showing you, here's the belief system you should hold to. And you know, he wants us to hold those beliefs. That's why he's tweeting them out. That's why he's using his Instagram in the way he is. And in a similar way, we want people to reconstruct. We're not saying don't reconstruct. We're not playing this game. We're saying, no, you need to reconstruct. You need to, what we say, reform your faith.
Yeah.
But here's the way to do it. So we're giving you a process that's better than the deconstruction process. Okay. Everyone's going to go through a process. We think our way is a better way.
Yeah. And when I was, reading into your book as well, one question that kept popping to my mind was, well, what's so special about deconstructionism? It's about leaving the faith, and people have been leaving the faith in a way since Paul's time, and Demas loved the world and left the faith. And this point about the postmodern base of the movement gave clarity that this is what we find as distinctly different between the typical new atheist that we would normally find. Because the new atheist also would have disdain for scriptural authority, but he's not outrightly postmodern. He would say, well, what evidence do you have? What argument you would have? And that distinction of postmodernism basis, where we see this movement completely distinct from other falling away from faith that you would see with other new atheists. And that your book gave a well sorted clarity onto that. And it's against this backdrop of postmodern underpinnings of the movement that I want to ask one other question. Now, I realize it may be too far-fetched of a question to ask, but what does the future of this movement look like? I mean, do you see this movement spreading into other cultures, or is the spread and furthering of this movement something that is there because of the cultural breeding route that America has, given the postmodern backing the movement has?
I think that's the key. I think that this movement is growing, especially in the West, of the cultural influence. Relativism, the idea that there is no truth, is kind of the air we breathe. It's the water, you know, the fish are swimming in. We don't even realize, a fish doesn't realize they're wet, right? They don't even realize because that's the culture that's the world the environment they exist in. In a similar way, I think that we are in a very kind of postmodern culture in many ways. My hope is that this thing does. My hope is our book isn't necessary. Okay. Like this movement up, people see the problems with it and it disappears. You very insightfully pointed out that the new atheists, they deconstruct, not in the way we use the word. Many of them would have said, we're trying to follow the evidence. Okay. And so we would make a between people who leave the faith because they thought the evidence wasn't good for Christianity, or they were persuaded that the evidence is better for another view. Okay. That's different than deconstruction, which, like we just said, it's not about objective truth, it's about subjective truth. It's a postmodern process. So actually our hope, and we've seen some of this, where people who don't agree with us, they're not Christians, but they have the same concerns we do with the postmodern movement, because they see the problems with postmodernism. Okay. So so for example, like a guy like Rhett McLaughlin, a lot of people know Rhett McLaughlin from Good Mythical Morning. He's probably one of the most famous guys who deconstructed their faith. I didn't even know who he was until I watched his first deconstruction video 4 years ago. And I've been kind of keeping up with all his videos. Every year they do another podcast, kind of updating their spiritual journey. And what's interesting about Rhett McLaughlin, that man, he seemed on a discovery for truth. and what the evidence is. Okay. So he's constantly reading, he's looking into the debates between Christians and atheists. And so what he's doing, I wouldn't call deconstruction. At least, I mean, to me, it seems like he legitimately is trying to figure this out. He's not convinced about Christianity right now. Fair enough. Okay. He's been persuaded by other kinds of evidence. And that's possible. People could, maybe if they don't hear the kinds of evidence or whatever that would persuade one person that Christianity is true, they're not persuaded by that. Okay. I mean, this is kind of like there's lots of people out there who believe in a flat earth. And what happens is they watch a bunch of videos or read some books on it and they become persuaded by it. Now, I don't think the earth is flat. Most people don't. They think it's a sphere. Her thing wasn't postmodern. It was the facts, and they think them, even though I think they're mistaken. And I think that's more of a Rhett, and there's others. Lots of atheists have, I think, gone through that process. Deconstruction is new for this time and place because I think that the process is totally different. The how is different than how Rhett McLaughlin did it or how some others did it. The how is, as we just described, there's no correct destination. Ultimately, it's a self-directed process, not a truth-directed process. Right. And of course, this goes back to the beginning. You know what I'm saying? Like putting yourself as the authority is what happened in the Garden of Eden. Yeah. Okay. So that's not a new thing. And so we're seeing that this is playing out today on kind of a massive scale. But the other element is social media. People are persuaded more by story than they are argument, especially in a postmodern world. And so in a postmodern world, you share your story about a conversion to whatever, atheism. It's just not even the evidence, but the story itself becomes the tool by which people are persuaded. So I can't tell you how many people watch Rhett and Link on their podcast and were messaging me saying, man, their story has got me doubting. And again, they hadn't even looked into the evidence themselves yet. They just watched the video, and that kind of story. And it happens with atheists to Christians too, like Lee Strobel. Most people know who Lee Strobel is, a journalist who went from atheist to Christian. And we're persuaded by this. I've seen people come to Christ at events because Lee Strobel told his story, right? So it wasn't necessarily, although he does add some of the evidence in there to the story, but just hearing the story itself is like, wow, maybe I should start thinking about my own spirituality. Maybe I should start thinking about the afterlife. So I think social media allows people to get online and tell their story, and they have an audience, whether it's 100 people or 100,000 people. And that's powerful, especially in our culture today. I'll add this one other thing. I was talking with a philosopher today, actually. His name's Travis Dickinson. He's writing a review of our book for Christianity Today, and he wanted some clarification on some stuff. And I pointed out to him, the reason apologetics isn't going to be as effective responding to someone who's a deconstructionist is because they're not truth guided or truth seeking or truth oriented. It works for someone who is. So when you talk to like Lee Strobel, who's searching whatever, evidence played a huge role in his conversion. But it's not going to work is that Christians are going to think, man, this apologetic stuff doesn't work for people because they've been talking to the deconstructionists who's postmodern in their process rather than the Rhett McLaughlin who's out there kind of just looking at, reading all the books and trying to figure out, is God real? Can I trust his word? All those things. So this is where we need to understand apologetics is a great tool. Yeah. When we're using it in the right way. And there's lots of applications for it. I love apologetics. We use it all the time. But there are some audiences where you're just going to be spinning your wheels. And the reason is because you're using the wrong tool to respond to the deconstructionists.
Yeah, and it is also a great reminder for us to, again, remind ourselves that sometimes a pure evidential apologetics way won't work. You may have to venture into narrative apologetics and see what works. And then, like you
Yeah.
said, sometimes apologetics as a whole may not be the right tool. And that's a good
Yeah.
reminder for all of us who are engaged in this field. Now, the three distinctions that you've pointed out about the movement, well, there is no end towards it. There is no right destination, and then the rejection of scriptural authority. And now we have around
Ah,
20 minutes left, and I want to focus more into it. In your book, you mentioned about the wrestling that the movement has with toxic theology. Now, we've heard about liberating theology, and in India, we have Dalit theology and different versions of it. But what is toxic
mm.
theology, and what's happening there? What do they mean by it?
Yeah. So this is where when we're seeing this word all over the place, especially if you start to go down into the echo chamber, hashtag deconstruction or hashtag evangelical, you'll start to see the word toxic being used. And sometimes it's being used appropriately, I think, and sometimes inappropriately. So there are doctrines that you could find that would be something that is absolutely harmful and isn't a true doctrine.
Hmm.
Okay. Here's the thing, you have to know what's true
Hmm.
before you can label it as toxic. Problem is in this movement is things that people don't like are just labeled as toxic from the get-go. And so
Right.
a toxic theological doctrine would be a doctrine that I deem to be harmful. Well,
Hmm.
why? Because I say so, right? So for example, um, we would see something like Jesus died for your sins. That is like the gospel. Okay.
That is the good
That's
news.
at least, yeah, that's what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, that Jesus died for your sins. And now that is when we got the receipts, we put them in the book actually and talked about this a little bit, where people say that is to tell someone that Jesus died for their sins is toxic. Why? Because you're telling them they're sinners
Hmm.
and that they need a substitute and that this guy had to pay, he died on my behalf. This is all toxic. You tell someone that there's a hell, that's cosmic child abuse. That
Hmm.
is toxic. You're doing this wrong thing. You're going to psychologically mess someone up by telling them there's a hell. Now, here's again, going back to, if it's true that there is a place called hell, then it's not harmful to tell
Hmm.
them that that place exists and that
Yeah.
here's the way to avoid going to that place. If there is no hell, then yeah, sure. If we're just making
Hmm.
something up here, then yeah, you could say that's harmful. You're like, being manipulative or whatever. But again, it comes back to what is actually true. And so I use this illustration. I tell my kids not to jam a knife into the wall socket because electricity is real. And being electrocuted is a real thing that is absolutely deadly. And so here's the warning. In a similar way, um, and again, I want to be age appropriate here. I'm not telling my kids about hell when they're, 3 years old, but there comes a time, hey, there's a place that really exists for sinners. And here's the solution to this problem. That is a different thing. Okay. So again, it comes back to what's true, and then
Yeah.
you can move forward to what's harmful. I think that's a really important and helpful distinction for people as they start to see doctrines being
Hmm.
called toxic. Now, let me just add this one more thing. There is pastors who have done harm, real harm. There
Hmm.
are talk. I mean, on Netflix, you can watch these like docu-series, and they have a bunch on different, Mormon cults. There's one that my wife and I were watching, this fundamentalist LDS movement. It's all about polygamy.
Hmm.
They teach polygamy there. The one guy has 60 wives. Okay, the leader, who's called the prophet of this little cult, has 60 wives. Now, that teaching that if you
Hmm.
have more wives, you end up having a better celestial heavenly existence. That's their belief.
Hmm.
I believe that is toxic. But the reason I believe it's toxic is because it's true. Okay. It's harmful, and you can go through that. But you start with, well, what's the truth of the matter? So that's the difference. Okay. And so that guy, we would say, yeah, he was really spiritually abusing and physically
Hmm.
abusing those people. But you can't even get off the ground in making that accusation without knowing what's true.
Yeah. And with the case of these toxic theology instances that you mentioned, the emotional tangent to these quite relevant, and much
Yeah.
care and concern must be taken into account when engaging with this, because these are not merely doctrinal disputes, or someone
Yeah.
saying disputing the divinity of Christ or something, emotionally
Mm,
independent in that regard. So, and as people
yeah.
who engage with these questioners, much focus has to be given in that regard.
And that's what we try to do in the book, by the way.
Hmm.
We're trying to, and hopefully that comes across. This is hard to talk about because there are real people who are hurting and who are really asking questions, who have experienced different kinds of abuse and who are emotionally feeling the weight of some of these doctrines. And so what we try to do in the book is have that compassion, weep with those who weep, mourn with the mercy on those who doubt. These things come into play. We're not just logic machines trying to beat people
Hmm.
up, and that's a really important aspect to all this as well. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah. And within the deconstruction movement, like, to recap, I mean, this is a movement that is about moving away from faith. This is about leaving historic Christianity for something else. And because of its very unique nature, I sense that there is a natural bridge between the deconstruction movement and progressive Christianity. We won't find this
Mhm.
within the New Atheist movement. So,
Yeah.
why is there that connection? I mean, why, as you mentioned, I think you meant the naked pastor himself, whose name shall not be
Mhm.
searched on the web engines. The naked pastor himself, he has his own way of moving into progressive theology. And when I had Alyssa Childers
Mhm.
on the podcast to talk about her book, The Another Gospel, in that also we were mentioning, how people have the same sort of idea about toxic theology, or that's cosmic child abuse,
Mhm.
and we see a lot of overlap there.
Mhm.
Um, but why
Mhm.
is there this very unique, unholy union between the deconstruction movement and progressive
Mhm.
theology? Is there something that we haven't noticed yet?
Yeah, I think there is. I think that I mean, this is what I noticed very early on. It's why we wrote a book together.
Hmm.
This is kind of how the story developed. I was teaching on deconstruction, doing a full week of teaching, had written over 500 words kind of to put together for 5 different sermons or talks. And halfway through that week, sent a text message to Elisa because I noticed that there is a connection between construction and progressive Christianity. A lot of people who are on the path of deconstruction in progressive Christianity. And that's why I messaged her. She had written a book on progressive Christianity, and I wanted to know, did you notice this?
Hmm.
And you should be the one, Elisa, to write a book, almost like a prequel. Okay, so it's like, here's your book, Another Gospel on progressive Christianity. Well, here's the vehicle that gets people to progressive
Hmm.
Christianity, and the vehicle is deconstruction. So I absolutely think there's a connection. I think
Yeah.
that because a lot of the coaches that are out there, the
Hmm.
deconstruction coaches, are progressive
Right.
Christians. They're kind of advocating for those views as well. So they're not just a deconstructionist, but they're also a progressive Christian. So I think that we end up seeing a lot. They're the most vocal, and so we see a number of people kind of
Hmm.
following those accounts and then following the influencer who runs those accounts and in their belief system. So there's absolutely a connection. I think that that's a really good option. My hope is that just like the emergent church movement of a few
Hmm.
decades ago, this progressive Christian movement, I think, is it's kind of like that modern liberal movement that was
Right. Yeah.
responded to 100 ago. This thing keeps popping up. And my hope is that progressive Christianity, that there's enough of a response that this thing goes underground, disappears,
Hmm.
and along with it, deconstruction. And of course, probably a generation or two from now, it will pop back up. So I think that, we're called, this is our movement where we're called to respond to this very insidious movement, progressive Christianity. And one way we're going to do that is by understanding the deconstruction movement. So progressives love deconstruction. They do. You're not going to find many progressive Christians who are criticizing the deconstruction movement. And there's a reason for that. This is the call that gets people from historic Christianity into progressive Christianity. Just hop in the vehicle of deconstruction and you'll get there.
Yeah, and that's that the vehicle way of phrasing it is puts into perspective really well. And my sort of rudimentary analysis of this would be, and I could be completely wrong, is that because there is no very clear end goal, because there is no clear destination to reach to, I think people still move out of the historic Christian movement wanting for something to hold on to. As we mentioned, the deconstruction speaker himself saying that this is existentially exhausting, to deconstruct constantly. At some point, people would want to latch on to something that they had left behind. With the new atheist, he is clear. I mean, he doesn't want this, and he's going to move into scientism or something distinct. For him, the destination is clear. So I think maybe that sort of lack of destination to go to may linger in their minds, wanting them to latch onto something that they had been familiar with all their lives. But I could be wrong.
Well, just to piggyback on that, I think that deconstruction, because it's self-directed in a lot of ways, like you're the boss, you're the final authority, not the Bible. There's a kinship with progressive Christianity. It's the same idea. You'll find progressive Christians who will say Moses was wrong, Paul was wrong.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, they're the authority. So it's a natural segue. If you want to hold on to some of the Christians' trappings, but get rid of all the doctrines you don't like, then there you go. Hop into progressive Christianity, and you've invented your own religion and your own God.
Yeah, and in the same sense, the whole deconstruction movement has a pseudo religious nature towards it. I mean, the deconstruction speakers, charging money for their consultations, and the way they run the whole movement has that very pseudo religious nature towards it. But I think that sort of gets the green flag because it's the self that is the self authority, self reigning as God over everything. So anything that is devoid of the scriptural authority, anything that is devoid of divine authority, sort of gets an easy pass within the movement, I guess. Now, as we come to the conclusion of this very interesting and riveting conversation, I want to get into a bit of a practical application. We have around 10 minutes on our hand. So one of the key elements of the deconstruction movement is the nature of asking questions and wrestling with doubts. Now, our listeners are very familiar that our ministry, SAFT, it stands for Seeking Answers, Finding Truth, a name that we drew from inspiration of the late Nabeel Qureshi's book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus. And so as a Christian movement, none of us are unfamiliar to the notion of asking questions or wrestling with doubts. We do that within ourselves on a daily basis, if not much less frequently. So as we respond to the deconstruction movement, because it has a lot of wrestling with doubts and asking questions sort of integral to the whole nature of its existence, a pushback against the deconstruction movement may be perceived as a pushback against asking questions, or a call or invite to blindly believe and to hold on to what there is without any dissidence or anything of that sort. What is a very healthy and carefully curated way to engage with it? It may be too difficult to unpack within a few minutes, but what would be your helpful tips for all of us to keep in mind?
Yeah, this is really good. Because I think the deconstruction movement, if there's anything positive I can say about it, it has been kind of a wake-up call, I think, to the church that we need to do better at making environments that are open to questioners and doubters. And so we actually devote an entire chapter in our book called Questions. And our hope is that, man, if there's one chapter every church pastor reads, we need to create a space where people feel like they can come with their questions. Because every deconstruction story, every single one I've heard, had unanswered questions. And I mean, we could go down that path and why that is. But at the end of the day, the church needs to be that environment where, hey, come ask your questions. Absolutely. Now, you may not like the answers we give. Okay, fair enough. but we don't want you to leave because we said you can't ask your questions. So by the way, when it comes to the research on, people leaving the church and leaving the faith, one of the things the researchers noticed is that doubt wasn't the problem. It was unexpressed doubt. And so what we don't want is that kind of unexpressed doubt or that suppressed leads to disaster. Okay. That leads to an unhealthy faith or a loss of faith altogether. Want is people to express their doubts and in the process actually grow in their love for God. And we think there's evidence of that. We see that happen. In fact, the research bears that out. So I would want to say, man, ask your questions, express your doubts, do it in a community that you trust, obviously, people that will hunt for answers with you. It's not enough just to ask the questions or express your doubts, but do it with people who are willing to take the time to hunt down those answers for you. I know a lot of these deconstructionists, they don't really care about the answers, to be honest. The Naked Pastor, for example, he would say that answers aren't where it's at. He says, just, well, hold on a sec. Again, that's existentially exhausting. I think as human beings, we all want to know deep down what some of the answers are. Now, we don't have all the answers. We'd be the first to say that. We say it in our book. There's lots of questions that I don't have answers to, and I'm an apologist. And so we got to be real about that. There's things that God has just not revealed and has not explained. Fair enough. But that doesn't mean we don't know anything. There are certain things we can know because God has revealed himself, either in scripture, in nature, or through his son. So search for those answers and know at the end of the day that Jesus can handle your questions and your doubts. We see this over and over in scripture. We see it with John the Baptist. When John the Baptist says, "Are you the guy? Or should we look for someone else?" And so he's doubting. He's asking, what does Jesus do? He provides evidence. He says, look, the deaf are hearing, the blind are seeing. All these things that the Messiah is supposed to be doing, I'm doing them. And then he turns to his disciples and says, there's no one greater than John the Baptist. Almost like, they're probably wondering, is this guy a bad Christian? Like, is John lost his way? No, John hasn't lost. John is asking a legitimate question here, and here's the answer. And that's how we could handle his doubt. When the father comes to Jesus and his son falling into the fire and he's at kind of wit's end, he doesn't know what else to do. And Jesus says, just believe. And he says, I do believe, help my unbelief. Again, here's this guy who says, I'm telling you, I'm being honest with you. I believe a little, but I also don't believe a little, but I need you to help my unbelief. That we call that the iffy prayer, if you can do this, Jesus, and Jesus says, he responds and actually heals the son as a result. So the whole point is, as humans, you're not going to go through this life without questions and doubts. It's not a matter of if they come, but when they come. And so when they do come, here's the process to go through. And it's express your doubts, doubt out loud, do it with people you trust, then go search for those answers, and then of course understand that this is okay. Jesus doesn't think you're a bad Christian for asking your question or expressing your doubt. So those are all kind of aspects that I would want to speak to the going through this process legitimately. At the same time, if you're talking to a deconstructing loved one, the process is going to be a little bit different, okay? Because in how you respond. Because as we said earlier, you can't just say, oh, here's evidence that demands a verdict. Just read this book and that'll straighten you out, That's going to miss the mark by a mile. Why? Because it's probably not just an evidence thing or a truth thing. There's something else going on. And in which case we offer a number of practical kind of advice at the end of our book. And we say things like, hey, pray, because it's going to take an act of God to kind of work in their life and on their heart. Of course, I mean, it's a no-brainer, but you got to start with prayer. You have not because you ask not. Jesus said that, how about stay calm and don't freak out. This is, I think a lot of Christians blow it because their son or daughter comes to them and says, I'm deconstructing. They lose their mind. stay calm with the goal of staying in their life. So I want my daughters to know I love you, period. If you walk away from Jesus, or if you're questioning or doubting, whatever, that doesn't change my love for you. My love for you never changes. Okay. It's not I love you, but it's I love you, period. I'm going to fight my instinct to start launching into trying to fix their theology or their faith. Like, here, let's go for
Hmm.
coffee and I'm going to straighten you out, kind of thing. That is not going to work. Okay. They didn't deconstruct over coffee. You're not going to somehow have them reconstruct over coffee. It doesn't work that way. A lot of people are in deconstruction, have been there for weeks, months, maybe years. So this is something that you're going to want to walk with someone for a long period of time, likely. So you're going to do treat how can you respond in the best way in that moment? Some, it's going to be, we're not talking theology right away,
Yeah.
we're just I'm going to be there for you. I'm going to be the shoulder to cry on, vent about bad stuff the church has done. Hey, I'll be right
Hmm.
there with you, you know? Um, and then when you come to me and say, what do you think about this belief or this doctrine or this whatever? Hey, we can have that conversation. But I'm going to set boundaries. I'm going to set boundaries because I don't want
Hmm.
every time we get together it to be a debate or something.
Hmm.
I want to have a good, healthy relationship with you. So I would tell if my daughter deconstructed, she's 12 now, but let's imagine she's 20, she comes to me, deconstructs. I would want to say, honey, I want to talk about those philosophical, theological, all those things, but let's set aside time for that. I just want to be your dad most of the time, So we're going to go to movies and we're going to go shopping and we're going to play board games and we're going to do all the stuff that, dads and daughters do. We're going to, because that's important. Because truth always needs to be in the context of relationship. Those
Hmm.
things always go together. This is the liability of a lot of stuff we do in apologetics. Typically I make a video and it's packed with I think is truth, but people don't often hear it because they don't know who Mr. B is. They think I'm just some arrogant whatever. They don't know me as a person. They're more likely to hear someone who they know and they
Hmm.
love. And that makes a difference. So as a practical step, that relationship is so key. Now, sometimes the relationship gets broken. And it's not because something you did, it's because that person wants nothing to do with you because of your toxic beliefs. And that's where you're just going to have to trust the Lord, pray
Hmm.
that that relationship can be restored and that the relationship with God will be just restored. Because there's not much you can do if they break it off. It's kind of like divorce. I mean, I've witnessed people who have had a spouse leave. They cut it off. They said, I want nothing to do with you. And it didn't matter what the other spouse wanted
Hmm.
to do. Let's go to counseling. Let's do this. Let's do that. It didn't matter. That other person said, we're done. I don't want to
Hmm.
ever see you again. And there was nothing they could do. And I think in a similar way that happens in these kinds of relationships as well. So there's some real practical steps. Again, you got to read the book if you want to see kind of some of that fleshed out in more detail. And hopefully, again, we wrote this book for the church. We desperately want to see the church equipped to understand and respond to this issue because there's a whole lot of confusion and there's ways that people have responded inappropriately. So we want to come in and help to avoid that.
Wow, that was a that was very well put, and it had a lot of quite relevant and important, pertinent practical applications for us to keep in mind. And like you said, as the saying goes, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care, and that's
Mm-mm. Amen.
extremely relevant in these sort of issues where emotional hurt and personal doubt are at play. People are not always logical and straightforward in the thinking, as we ourselves are not always are.
That's right. That's
Circumstances
right.
and emotions get the better of us, and the care and love and concern must be extended to them just as Christ extends to us on a daily basis and as he did it with his disciples and with those whom he interacted with. And
Mm-hmm.
and you actually gave a lot of practical inputs for us to keep in mind and to see what is the way that we can make an impact. And I believe, like you said, I hope that this dies out, the progressive Christianity movement and all of this dies out pretty soon, but we'll have to wait and see. And as Lucas Rueger, a good friend of mine who runs the Deflate channel, as he mentioned on the podcast a while back, there is a global youth culture, and it's spreading across cultures, spreading across domains, spreading across geographical boundaries and cultural boundaries. So even here in India, we have to gear up and anticipate if deconstruction movement, as we see in the West, would seep into India. But as long as progressive Christianity isn't as widespread, we may have cause for cheer, but we need to be prepared. Always prepared to give a reason for the hope that we have. So, and I believe that's a great place to come to an end to this very interesting and quite helpful discussion on the deconstruction movement and how we can be better witness and better ambassadors for Christ. And thank you so much, Tim, for taking your time out. I know you could have finished up around maybe 10 Red Pen Logic posts, but you took your time out to be here with us, and we absolutely love the work you do, and it was great. And we hope we will have you back again soon, sometime in the near future.
Well, I appreciate all the work that you're doing, and I would love to come back and have another discussion. Maybe we'll talk Red Pen Logic.
Excellent. Sounds great. And thank you everyone for joining in. We will catch you in the next time. Until then, take care and God bless.